Hello everyone. In this lesson, we'll be looking at some mathematical functions related with spreadsheets. You can see a list of the functions in front of you. Let's start with the first one. The name of the function is round, and it is used to round up values in a manner that's very similar to the mathematical round operation. To write the function, we start with the equal to sign and we type round, round, and within round brackets, we give the cell reference as the first parameter, the cell reference containing the value that needs to be rounded off, and then comma, and we need to provide the second parameter. The second parameter basically is used to specify the number of digits to which it's supposed to be rounded. So let's start with rounding it off to 2 digits after the decimal point. So I'm going to type 2 over here and press enter, and look what happens. Now the value has been rounded off to 0.25 from 0.245. Now because the value is 0.245, that's why it's been rounded off to 0.25. Had the value been, for example, let's say 0.243, then it would be rounded to 0.24, just like the mathematical round operation. Now let's say I want to round it off to 1 digit after the decimal point rather than 2. So I type 1 as the second parameter and press enter, and you can see that it's been rounded down to 0.2 from 0.243. Now if I were to change this value to, let's say, 0.27, for example, 0.27, then look what happens. It's rounded up to the next value because it's closer to that value now. Now sometimes the requirement is to actually round it off to the unit column. Unit column in the sense like this is a unit value, this is the 10 value, this is 100, and this is 1000. So sometimes we require to round it off to the unit value, or let's say to the closest integer value. Then in that case, what do we do? In that case, in the second parameter, we'd write 0. And this is what happens. Now, if I were to change this value to 1, 2, 3, 4, let's say 87, for example, then it would be rounded off to 1, 2, 3, 5, because obviously according to the mathematical operation, 4.8 exceeds 4.5, which is the smallest value that is needed to round it off to the next higher value. Sometimes we are required to round off the value to the unit column, or you can also be asked to actually round it off to show it as an integer value rather than a decimal point value. In that case, we would change the second parameter to a 0 instead of a 1, and the value is rounded down to 1, 2, 3, 4. Now because the original value is 1, 2, 3, 4.27 and 0.2 is smaller than 0.5, therefore it's rounded down to 1, 2, 3, 4. Now if the value was 0.5 or higher, for example, like this, then in that case it's going to be rounded up to the next value, which is 1, 2, 3, 5. Now sometimes we might be required to round it off to the next 10th value according to the second column. So in that case, we change the second parameter from 0 to -1, and look what happens. So it has rounded it off to the next 10 column value. Now if the value was 1, 2, 3, 6, for example, 0.5, then in that case it's going to be rounded off to the next higher value for the 10th column, which is 1, 2, 4, 0. And we can continue this way to the hundredths column as well, for example. So I change it to -2, and look what happens, 1200, because the original value is 1, 2, 3, 6. And if I were to change this value to, let's say, 1, 2, 7, 6.5, then it's going to be increased to 1300 to the next value according to the hundredths column. The next set of functions are round up and round down. They work in a slightly different manner to that of the round function. The round up function forcefully rounds a value to the next higher value. It takes parameters in a similar fashion to that of the round function, and the round down function rounds it down to the lowest value according to the second parameter that we specify. Now how does that actually work? We write the function as round up, give the cell reference, and then let's say I write 2 digits to round it up to, and I press enter, and it changes the value to 1234.25. Now, it would have worked in a similar manner with the round function as well, because the original value is 1234.245. So if I were to change this value to 1234.241, it will still be 1234.25. Let's try rounding it off to one decimal place. I do this and look, it did not return the value as 1234.2 because it's 0.241, but it returned it as 1234.3, which is the next higher value. So it rounded it up, it increased it. Similarly, if we were to return an integer value, we'd write 0 and it returns 1235. Okay, and we can continue in this way to the next columns, like the tens column or the hundreds column or the thousands column, as we did with the round function. The next one is round down, which does the opposite of round up. We write it down as round down, bracket open, give the cell reference, and then say, okay, 2 decimal places, we do this, and we get 1234.24 rather than 1234.25, which we had in the case of the roundup function, or even in the round function, it would have returned the same. But round down reduces it to the lowest value according to the second parameter specified. Now, if I were to say 1 decimal place, then this is what it returns. Now, let's say if the value is, for example, 1234.29, it will still return 0.2 because it's rounding it down to the lowest value according to the second parameter. Now, if you were to round it down to 0 decimal places, this is what it returns. So even if the value after the decimal point is 9, for example, 1234.9, it will still return 1234. Now, these two functions are special and they are normally required in specific activities where the examiner requires you to round up the value to the next higher value or round it down to the whole value in a particular scenario, rather than incorporating the fractional part, in which case we'd have to use the round down function. Mround is a special function which is not normally used in O-levels, and it's hardly used in A-levels as well, but the examiner has actually made reference to that in one of the exams in O-levels. So we'll go over this particular function as well. Now, what is the mround function meant to do? Let's take an example. Let's say if the amount that we have in this cell is the salary that has to be given to an employee for a particular week, for example, and the smallest denomination currency that they have is 5. Now, based on that, they can't possibly give them 1234. They can give them 1230 or 1235. So how do we get that value automatically? We use the mround function to fix that problem. We give the cell reference and then we write the multiple that we require, the multiple of 5 in this particular case. So when I press enter, it returns 1235. Now, if suppose the value were 1231, for example, 1231.245, it returns 1230 because that is closer. 1231 is closer to 1230 rather than 1235. And 1230 is the lowest multiple in this particular case as per the original value provided. Now, mround always returns integer values, whole number values, not fractional values. The next function is the int function. The int function is one of the commonly used functions for both O and A-level examinations. This is required when you want to only return the part of the value which is on the left-hand side of the decimal point without accommodating the part which is on the right-hand side of the decimal point. So we write the function as equal to int, give the cell reference, it only takes one parameter, and brackets close and press enter, and this is what you get. Now, even if the value in this case were, let's say, 134.999, it will still return 1.1234, which shows that it did not accommodate the numbers on the right-hand side of the decimal point. The next two functions are Ceiling.Math and Floor.Math. Now, these functions are somewhat similar in operation to that of the roundup and rounddown functions. Now, you might ask as to why we require two functions with similar operations. Well, like I said, they're somewhat similar, not exactly similar. You can think of the Ceiling.Math and Floor.Math functions as a combination of the roundup and mround function, or a combination of the Rounddown and the Mround function respectively, where the Mround function automatically sort of functioned partly in a way similar to that of the round function, this one, but it accommodated the multiple of a certain value that we had to specify as the second parameter. The Ceiling.Math and Floor.Math functions do the forceful increase or decrease of the value, just like the Roundup and Rounddown functions, but they also accommodate the multiple of a given value. So how do they actually work? We write the function as equal to Ceiling.Math, give the cell reference as the parameter, and let's say I want the value that's the multiple of 2. So I'd write 2 over here and press enter. And look what it returns, 1, 2, 3, 6. Now 1, 2, 3, 4 is also a multiple of 2. Then why did it not return 1, 2, 3, 4? Reason is the ceiling function. It rounds up the value to the next higher value. So because the value is bigger than 1, 2, 3, 4, it's 1, 2, 3, 4.245. Therefore, it rounded it up to the next higher multiple of 2, right? Get it? Now, if suppose I wanted the multiple of 3, then in that case, look what happens. It gives the value 1, 2, 3, 6 in this case again, because obviously the lower multiple of 3 is less than 1, 2, 3, 4. So the next higher multiple is returned 1, 2, 3, 6 as 1, 2, 3, 6. Now let's take a look at the Floor.Math function and see the comparison. Floor.Math, give the cell reference, comma, and let's say we want the multiple of 2. What does it return? 1, 2, 3, 4. Now it did not return 1, 2, 3, 6. It returned 1, 2, 3, 4. So it rounded it down rather than rounding it up. Now let's say if I want to return the multiple of 3, let's see what it does in that case. It returned 1, 2, 3, 3. Interestingly, it didn't return 1, 2, 3, 6. It returned 1, 2, 3, 3 because it is supposed to round it down to the smaller multiple rather than the higher multiple. So I hope you understand the difference between the two functions and the difference between ceiling and roundup and floor and rounddown functions. The next function is the rand function. The rand function is used to generate a random number between the values 0 and 1. Now since 1 comes right after 0, so obviously it means that it's going to be returning a decimal point value rather than actually an integer value. Let's remove these because they are not required for these two functions. So how does it work? We write equal to rand and we do not give any parameter between the round brackets and we press enter and look what has it returned, 0.7, 5, 6 and onwards. So it has returned a random value between 0 and 1. Let me recalculate it. Formulas, calculate now, and look, it again returned a random value between 0 and 1, again, and again. So you can see that the values are in the range 0 and 1. Now we can make a mathematical formula through which we can actually change the value that's being returned, but we will not go into that detail right now because we are focusing mainly on the functions. Or let me just give you a small example to give you an idea. Now, if you're required to actually return a number between 0 and 4, what would you do? You would simply write a formula such as this one equal to this into 5, and it returns this. So what it is actually returning is the value between 0 and 4, 5 values. Now, if I want to specifically have it return a value between 1 and 5, then I'd need to further edit the formula. Now that's going to make the operation a little more confusing for some people. So an alternative to that is provided using the Randbetween function. It actually kind of gives you an additional functionality as well. As you can guess from the name of the function, Randbetween. So this means that we can actually specify the starting and the ending values and it will return us the value between those two values. How does it actually work? Equal to Randbetween. I can give the starting value, let's say, as 1 and the ending value as 10, and look what happens. It returned 1. Calculate now. 7, 5, 3, Okay. Now, let's say I want the value to be not between 1 and 10. I want it to be between 5 and 10. And now look what happens. Now it will never return a value that's less than 5, and it will never return a value that's greater than 10. See? So this is the cool functionality that we have with the Randbetween function. The next function is ABS, which stands for absolute value. And this is also a mathematical operation. Sometimes for some situations, we want quantity to be returned instead of the sign. Sometimes the value returned for a particular mathematical operation would be negative. And the value that we require for further work in the spreadsheet is just the quantity part. We don't actually want the sign part. So we can use the ABS function for that purpose. Now let's take a look at that. Let's say if the value that I have is 2, 6, and 7. So if I were to use the ABS function like this, ABS, and then give the cell reference as the parameter and press enter, it returns the same value. No change. But if the value were, let's say, minus 267, it still returns 267. So it is returning the actual quantity, the numeric quantity, excluding the sign. It is returning the numeric quantity excluding the sign, the negative sign. So if the requirement is of the nature where you would want only the value to be returned. Let me give an example of that. Let's say if you had a scenario where you were supposed to calculate the difference in the sales price and the purchase price of a product for a user, and you had to then identify or output whether the user made profit on the sale of the product or incurred a loss, and you also need to specify the difference as a value. Now, if you were to subtract the purchase price from the selling price, which is obviously supposed to be higher, and the value comes as positive, then it means that the user made profit. But if it comes as negative value, then it means that the user incurred a loss on the sale of that product. So if you were required to output the loss incurred, then rather than writing it as a negative value, saying that, okay, you incurred a loss of minus something, it would be relatively better to actually say that you incurred a loss of, let's say, 10 or 20. That would be relatively better. So the ABS function would come in handy for such a scenario. The next function is the mod function. This is quite a useful function, and it is required often in the spreadsheet activity. The mod function returns the remainder of a division operation. How does it actually work? Equal to mod. Now rather than giving cell references, I'm just going to write down the values directly first and then repeat it with cell references. So the first parameter that I have to give is the value that is to be divided. So let's say I write 10. And then the next parameter that I have to give, it requires 2 parameters. So the next parameter that I give is, let's say, 2. So now the intention of this function is to basically return the remainder when 10 is divided by 2. So when I press enter, it returns 0 because 10 is fully divisible by 2. But instead of that, if I write, for example, let's say 9, then it returns 1 because 2 goes 4 times into 9, where we get the multiple 8, and that is the largest number that you can subtract from 9. You can't subtract a larger value than that, and the next larger multiple would be 10 actually. So once you've subtracted 8 from 9, you're left with 1. So that is why the remainder returned is 1. Now let's try something different. Division by 3. Now because 9 is totally divisible by 3, so it returns the remainder as 0. Now if I were to change the value 9 and replace it with 10, look what happens. It returns 1. If I were to change it to 11, it returns 2. But if I change it to 12, then because 12 is completely divisible by 3, so the remainder returned is 0 again. I use values in this particular case. Now we can do the same thing with cell references. So let me delete this one. And I'm going to write the mod function over here. Equal to mod. Give this cell as the first cell reference and then give this cell as the second cell reference. It's returning an error message right now because there are no values in both cells. So it's kind of like similar to dividing a 0 by 0, which is actually an illegal operation in mathematical terms. So that's why it's giving us an error. So if I were to write the value 10 over here and I write the value 3 over here, it returns 1 as a remainder. If I write 6 over here, it returns the value 4 because the largest multiple of 6 that can be subtracted from 10 is 6. And the next larger one would actually be 12. So when you subtract 6 from 10, you're left with 4. So this is using the mod function with cell references where you can change the values in the cells, the relevant cells, and see the effect of that in the cell where you've written the mod function. The last function is the square root function, which is again a very simple mathematical operation, very familiar one. How do we write this function? Equal to Sqrt, bracket open, and then we provide the number, let's say 9, and I press enter, and this is what it returns. Now similar to the other functions, we can give a cell reference in this case as well. Like for example, instead of writing the 9 over here, I simply give this as a cell reference, press enter. It's returning 0 because right now there's no value in that cell. If I write, for example, 4 over here, it returns 2, which is the square root of 4. And if I write, let's say 25 over here, it returns 5, which is the square root of 5, and so onwards. So these were the mathematical functions in Excel that you're supposed to be familiar with. That's it for this lesson.